We've got a number of questions. I'm going to call on Nacho and then Nicholas afterwards. But first of all, could I just take the opportunity to ask Tobias? Tobias, you've been calling for sort of basically a stronger response. And there's been quite a lot recently in the airwaves about people saying, are we right to continue to say, well done, Ukraine, you carry on while we sit back, except giving them lethal weapons? But still, it's like we're all encouraging them to stand firm, and while we go to bed quietly and easily in our own beds at night. What do you have a concern about that? I think I just want to ask you to set that out. And also, well, what is it you think we should do? Because, you know, it's also a fact that Russia has 10 times as many lethal nuclear weapons as NATO does. And so there is a real concern about any sort of escalation.
This is the critical question that I think is dominating the White House right now. But we are still, I think, exhibiting a peacetime construct in our decision making, and we need to be more robust, show more fortitude, more grasp of the situation to be able to make incremental decisions to stand up proportionately to what we see happening at play on the ground, without immediately assuming and almost panicking that every decision we make is going to lead to nuclear war. And you touched on it yourself. We even get to the point where President Biden actually declares, I don't want to start World War III. That's actually showing our timidity. It's showing how risk averse we've become. It's actually encouraging Putin to exploit and explore how far he can actually push things on his side. Now, it could be on no-fly zone, which has almost become totemic, if you like, on Western, greater Western intervention. I actually don't disagree that perhaps needs to be considered very hard, in detail, and perhaps dismissed. But you don't declare to your opposition what you're not going to do. We spent more time telling Putin what we refuse to do rather than saying what we might do. And I spoke to the defense minister today for Ukraine. I met him very briefly, who was in town. And it's clear that the direct trajectory of events right now is actually not going in Ukraine's favor, simply because the munitions are not going in. We're still hesitating about whether to send in defensive or offensive weapon systems. Now, their initial invasion tactics failed supremely. They thought they were going to liberate the country. We knew that. But they're now bombing from afar. And they have weapon systems which they can do this. They want to destroy cities, send refugees out of the country, meaning what's left in Ukraine is actually easier to control. A city which is 1/8 the size of what it was is far easier as a dominating force to control than one that is fully intact with a working class and then a vibrant insurgency that's then going to have a pop at you. And so we are seeing an entire country destroyed before our eyes. And the growing population is saying, why are we stepping back? Why are we not doing more? So I've no doubt about it that there is a higher risk involved here. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. But at the moment, we're showing such timidity, it's being exploited by the other side.
Okay, thanks very much, Tobias. And Nacho, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amber. Just to start, I wanted to comment that I think Felix was quite generous talking about clumsy wording from the Prime Minister this weekend in his comparison of the Brexit vote and the situation in Ukraine. I'm not sure that's out of clumsiness or he knew exactly what he was saying and what it says about his fitness to be Prime Minister. Even if it's out of clumsiness, it says a lot about his fitness to be Prime Minister. Anyway, the thing, one thing that I want to comment is, okay, in order to put a stop to the Putin regime, we need to start at home. The thing is that London is full of bankers, brokers, lobbyists, lawyers, accountants, even like public schools and universities, who take a lot of money out of people that are either Putin cronies or associates, or they had some links to all this kleptocracy. The thing is that, okay, when is the government going to act against this collaborationism? The thing is that these are people that had made a lot of money, frankly, because more honest people were not willing to take this business. And the thing is that they have been directly beneficiary from a regime that threatened us with weapons of mass destruction and which murders people in UK soil.
Is your question, why isn't the government doing more against oligarchs? Do you want to just
I
sum
think
it up?
what is the government doing in order to target not just the oligarchs that is now targeting after giving plenty of notice, by the way, but what is doing with the collaborationists that have been enabling these oligarchs and these people linked to the Putin regime for so long. And finally, the thing is that I think as conservatives, we should take stock and wonder why ourselves, why our party is in the news every week with this or is this other individual that maybe rightly or wrongly they are linked to they are talked about to having these links, and we can say about donors, we can say about people that had made business
I'm going to stop you if I may, Nacho. I think I've got the point. I'm going to pass it on to Tobias, but before I do that, if I may, having been Home Secretary at the time when some of this was sort of taking place, I have to say that the UK was very much, and I hope that David will back this up, it was usually the UK who was leaning heavily on the EU to get more sanctions in place. David Cameron was very clear about that when he was in government, and we were warning that Putin was a real danger. And when we had the Skripal, for instance, poisoning on the streets of London, and the Foreign Secretary, now the Prime Minister, did pretty well, hopefully supported by the rest of the government, in trying to get a strong response, not just from America, but from the rest of the EU. And some European countries were a little reluctant, and they preferred their more successful friendship with the Russians than standing up to Putin. So just to point that out, rather than think that London has always been the center of some trouble, it's been difficult over the past few years to point out to our European friends, particularly individual countries, the danger of being too close to Russia. So back over to Tobias now.
Yeah, I very quickly I can answer this. Yeah, we need to absolutely do more. If you are going to harm Putin, then you need to be able to get to the money that was stolen from the Russian people. A lot of that came through London. We were slow in providing the necessary legislation. Tom Tugendhat, who is chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, looked at this 4 years ago, did a great job in putting forward recommendations. They're now being taken up. And if we want to absolutely make sure that there is no area whereby Russian money can move in shell companies, in providing spending money and investment in the UK, then we need to act and act swiftly. So there's absolutely an appetite, if there wasn't before, to make sure that the legislation is now put in place.
Thanks very much. Nicholas, over to you for your question, and then we'll hear from Robert.
So Tobias, I completely agree with you on the need to be bolder. And I wanted to ask a question on how we can have the right sources of legitimacy, because we can't go through the UN if we have the Russian and maybe the Chinese veto. Equally, if we go purely wearing the mantle of NATO, it may seem too threatening, too much the first steps towards World War III. But surely some alternative, like coalitions of the willing, could be a way forward. And what about international brigades? What about the possibility of establishing and maintaining a safety zone over Lviv, which in military terms should be reasonably feasible? What do you have in mind in specific terms, and how do we justify it?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your question, and I don't disagree at all. We're not exploring this at all. You mentioned the United Nations Security Council, and of course the veto is there. And that begs bigger questions as to how a critical organization can be repaired for the next 50, 100 years, because clearly it's questionably fit for purpose now. What does work still is the UN General Assembly, which is everybody gets a vote. And there were times in the past where they passed legislation. They could provide safe haven areas over Ukraine right now. You could easily put safe haven areas over the nuclear power stations, legitimately calling for the fact that these should be isolated from the war because of the, the grave consequences of one of these plants blowing up. And look where the plume of winds, the prevailing winds, would take the fallout. You could pass that now, and that wouldn't require people offering to lean in and police it. It could simply be there as an international law, which, if breached, further goes against Putin himself to hold him up against war crimes. But also it will test China. And I make this point because as long as China is backing Putin and Russia itself, this all becomes very, very difficult. And then we can't be in denial that that is now the wider challenge, the bigger strategic challenge that we need to face. But certainly on a there are on a lower level, operational level, we could provide greater weapon systems, more sophisticated. Again, I spoke to the defense minister about this. More sophisticated anti-air systems, the Rapier system, for example. There are 60 MiG aircraft in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Poland that could be slid across to the Ukrainian Air Force today, if we wished, being blocked by one person, and that's President Biden. A political judgment being made, again, for fear that things will ratchet out of control. And we need to ask ourselves whether it's now we here on the continent need to take advantage of that. And I'll stick my neck out here. I think there is scope for the three nations, France, Britain, and Germany, as we did in the past, quietly, to lean in, to lead the way as to where European security should go, as to where the ideas are. We need almost like a Casablanca type conference. Work out what we want to do, let alone what the threats are and what they're coming, but how we actually work together. I'm afraid that the construct that we have, the complicated overlapping but not quite overlapping of the EU and NATO means that it is difficult to get unity across Europe. But if we're ever going to do it, now is the time to achieve that. And Germany's change, there is an opportunity, for Britain and Germany to then move forward. And I think France would have to then sort of join in with that as well. Difficult diplomatic back channels, to work there. But ultimately, these are the conversations I would like to think would be happening behind the scenes now. I fear they're not, though.
Thank you, Tobias. David, I'm going to come to you. What do you think of Tobias's bold suggestion, particularly given that France has the presidency of the EU? Is it wishful thinking? France, Germany, UK? What do you think?
Look, I don't want to bother you with domestic German politics, but just bear one thing in mind. You are now getting to know Olaf Scholz, who in the German Socialist Party is a reasonably sensible and moderate man. And our foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, is also in the Green Party, a moderate and sensible woman. But both parties have very strong left wings, and this government will spend a lot of time convincing the socialist and the Green backbench what this actually means. I mean, what has happened in Germany in the past few weeks is totally incredible. If somebody had told me 3 months ago that a socialist German chancellor would announce 100 billion euros extra investment fund, 2% target every year, NATO target, and many other things, it would have been unheard of. So the debates are less between the moderates in the government and the CDU-CSU in Germany. It will be more about the internal debates. But that's all I wanted to say on domestic German politics. So we will have to wait and see if this new approach is actually sustainable or if this is just a short-term reaction. The second remark I wanted to make is that, just like Tobias, I had the opportunity of speaking to the Ukrainian defense minister last week. He was a guest in our Foreign Affairs Committee meeting in the European Parliament, connected per video from Kiev. And he had 3 messages. thank you, European Union. Thank you, West, what you have done and what you are continuing to do. And then there are 3 points where we need more. Sanctions, 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 no-fly zone, and more weapons. And when it comes to sanctions, the European Union and our partners, including the UK, we have already imposed massive sanctions on Russia, unprecedented in scope. And I believe that these sanctions will be effective. Is there room for, or is there a necessity for a 5th sanctions package? I think we will see in the next few days. And this will once again need to be closely coordinated between Washington, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, London, Ottawa, and others. In the end, sanctions, I believe it's important that we target the Russian leaders, the elites, the strategic sectors of the Kremlin-run economy, and that our aim shouldn't be to harm the Russian people, but to weaken the Kremlin's ability to finance this outrageous war. On European defense, well, of course, there are actually 2 major military powers in Europe, Western Europe. That's the United Kingdom and France. Germany has always played a different role for obvious reasons, and I believe that Germany will continue to be perhaps a bit more cautious than others. This is deeply rooted in our mindset, but the time has now come that Germany understands that we cannot continue pretending to be a big Switzerland. We will have to shoulder more responsibility, and we will have to spend more on defense, but we will not only have to spend more on defense, we will also then have to prove that we are ready to shoulder more responsibility alongside our allies. And of course, France, the UK, and Germany, these are the 3 leading forces. And the difference simply is that France and the UK, of course, are nuclear powers, so they are playing in a different league than Germany. Something which will need to be balanced is, on the one hand, the cooperation of the 3, London, Paris, Berlin, perhaps preferred by some folks in London, and on the other hand, Germany, which is always keen to have a foreign and security and defense policy within the framework of the EU27, and then add other third countries to our cooperation. So we need to find some kind of structure and format there. And a final point, what Tobias was talking about. We will have to come up with new ideas how we can cooperate in Europe as long as the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is around, because not only has Russia invaded Ukraine and started a war of aggression, Russia has violated the whole European peace and security architecture, which was built up since 1945, and even the coldest hours of the Cold War, we had a structure like the Conference on the Security and Cooperation in Europe, and now the OSCE. So I mean, institutions like the Council of Europe, the OSCE, they have all now been destroyed in their form. They have been functioning for the last years and decades because simply Russia is behaving like an outlaw, and this will pose enormous challenges. How are we going to deal with such an aggressive Russia, which obviously no longer will stick to any kind of rules which we had agreed upon over many years and decades?
Thank you, David. Yes, a reminder there at the end that everything has changed and we're dealing with the immediate now, but there's going to be a lot of realignment taking place over the next few years. So I just want to get through a few more questions, if I may. I'm going to ask Robert Morland to ask his question. I think we've addressed John Knight's question, but so I'm going to come after that to Sajjad Karim's question about China. Thank you, Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much for that. Could I say in introduction I actually appreciated your point, Amber, at the very beginning about the role of the UK, because actually it's important in the sense that a number of other European countries were very hesitant about the Ukraine. And I think it goes back to this basic point that if Ukraine was a member of NATO, we would have been obliged to make a much more fundamental support of the Ukraine under the obligations of NATO and indeed of the EU. And therefore, my question really is directed largely to Tobias, that I'm a little concerned as to his interpretation of his, to quote him, the hesitance of the USA, in the sense that, does he think that if we had, hypothetically, an attack on any other country in the European Union or any other country in the EU, that the US would not be there in totally full support, because that would be surely their legal obligation at the moment. Do you think that is our great danger? And actually, I've been, as a former member of the European Parliament, to meetings of our former members association. We had one with the French government recently. And I've always said it's very important for countries to join NATO that are not members of NATO in the EU to get this kind of support. Finding still a bit of a split of view on that. And I'd like your comment.
Thank you, Robert. Tobias, can we just get your answer on that? And then I'm going to ask Sajid's question on China before we finish.
Yeah, I think, Sarah, I think you're probably referring to NATO rather than the EU. It is the NATO commitment, the Article 5 commitment that requires
it's also an EU one.
Nations to lead in. And quite rightly, we are seeing NATO countries in the West bolster support to our Eastern European allies. Indeed, Britain, Germany, and others are providing the necessary assistance. But ultimately, of course, that leaves Ukraine outside that particular area. I advocated a division, the NATO Rapid Reaction Corps, moving into Ukraine prior to the invasion, because part of this today is actually grabbing the space whilst you can, and before you bump into anybody else. What you don't want is that blue on red that could then allow events to trigger out of control. I put this forward back in November, and I actually at the smaller Munich security conference in some amazing hotel in the south of near Garmisch-Partenkirchen. I can't remember. David can tell me which one it was.
It's Schloss Elmau.
Quite an amazing place. If you ever need a spa, that's the place to go. Anyway, we'll digress. There were some senior American generals there, and I did ask whether we had the capability to mobilize and move forces in over a 3 or 4 day period. And they said, absolutely, if we had the political will. And you could have then taken, like a chess game, you could have moved your pieces into the no man's land and then dominated. And if you think now of the chaos, confusion, the pain, the slaughter that is taking place, not just in Ukraine, but the economic impact of the energy crisis that is now flowing across Europe, also the famine that will take place because of the wheat and the grain that will be denied in countries in Asia and so forth, and in other insecure parts of Africa as well. Maybe, just maybe, we should have done the political calculation to put forward and step forward and recognize that European security is what NATO is all about. Defending democracy is what NATO is all about. And that means not provoking a war, but preventing one by actually supporting and answering the request by President Zelensky back then to say, come and help us before it's too late. But we blinked.
Thank you, Tobias. Tobias, in your opening remarks, you covered a certain amount of the significance of this to China. David, just as we wrap up, could I ask you your view and whether it's being discussed much amongst European colleagues, the significance of this to China beyond Europe, obviously?
I would say that for 3 years now, we have a debate in the European Union, and our position how to deal with China has shifted. If I'm asked, what is the EU policy on China? I would always say it's the 3 English C's: cooperate where possible, compete where needed, and confront where necessary. China is a lot of things for us in one. China is the second most important trading partner for us in the European Union. It's a huge economic importance, especially for Germany. And if we want to address global challenges like climate change, we need China on board. So China can be a cooperation partner. On the other hand, when it's about competition, what we need is a level playing field. We need fair standards on both sides, and this is what is lacking. That's why we were hoping with the CAI, with the agreement, the investment agreement with China, that we could improve standards, but that is now in the deep freeze. But of course, we also need to confront China, because China has very, very different views than we do in the European Union, just like in the United Kingdom. And there is a growing reaction, not only in Europe, but also in the Pacific, to an increasingly assertive Chinese behavior in the region. So dealing with China will remain a high priority in the European Union, and we need to get it right. And I think that some of our member states were perhaps too naive in dealing with China, and they were also hoping that through trade, we could expect also some development for the better as regards human rights, the rule of law and democracy. All this didn't happen. One thing is very important, that we in the European Union, and I wish we could add the UK here, but we need to deal with China as a format of 27 on the one hand, +1 the EU, and China on the other hand. For far too many years, we had these formats 10+1, 11+1, 16+1, where our Eastern and Southeastern European partners were meeting on their own with China. If there's something which impresses China, then it's European unity. We need to show unity and we need to show strength. And when it comes to this horrible war, this war of aggression against Ukraine, China in the end will have to make up her mind. You cannot, on the one hand, be in favor and defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and on the other hand, remain neutral or silent towards an outrageous Russian aggression.
Thank you.
Final point, perhaps.
Yeah.
We might need China together with others to mediate, to negotiate, to host whatever talks that this war ends and that we have a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire.
Thank you very much, David. And I think we can all hope that one of the consequences of this might be a more united Europe, i.e. including the UK in terms of other future aggressors potentially. So I'm just going to wrap up now and apologise to Anthea, John and Cherry for not being able to get to you to hear your questions, but to give enormous thanks to Tobias and David for a really interesting discussion at such an important time. It's really fascinating to hear your perspectives, your determination, Tobias, and it's great to hear you, as I say, on the media. And David, thank you very much for giving us the European, and particularly, I like learning about German politics. We're going to need to know more and more about it. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our speakers and our questioners. And it's great to be with so many people who share our views about how important it is that the Conservative Party has a strong, powerful and influential relationship with the rest of our European friends. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. Bye.